Welcome to the Rig Doctor podcast, where I'm giving out remedies to soothe your ailing tone and fix your sick pedal boards. I'm your host, Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor. I've been building rigs for over a decade for many of the industry's top pros, and now I'm giving away all my secrets to DIYers just like you. I'm giving away all my tricks, tips, resources, and easy hacks that I've learned over the years so that you too can build a rig just like the pros. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so by sharing it on social media, subscribing to our podcast, or following us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also support this podcast financially by purchasing one of my products, Vertex Effects, from any of our authorized dealers, or becoming a member of our Patreon page. We have several membership levels as low as $4.99 a month that give you exclusive access to private live streams and Q&As, exclusive deals and discounts on Vertex products, as well as access to new product releases before anybody else. Also, you can get personalized one-on-one phone and email consultations with me, the Rig Doctor. This could be as in-depth as troubleshooting your pedal board with me in real time, or advising you on the best way to build your next rig. As always, I don't want money to be the block that prevents you from having your best possible tone. If you cannot afford to be a supporting member of our Patreon, you can always email us at info@vertexeffects.com, and our team will grant you full access to our standard tier of privileges on Patreon, free of charge, no means testing required. We trust that when your financial circumstances change, you will let us know and become a supporting member at that time. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Blue Microphones, for providing Yeti microphones for us to record all of our podcasts with, as well as our live streams. I'd also like to thank my own company, Vertex Effects, for providing the resources to make all of this stuff happen. If you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, you can always email us at info@vertexeffects.com, and we would be happy to hear from you. In today's episode, I'm bringing back my old friend Tony Lowe to help me co-host this podcast. We're going to be talking about amplifiers and wattages as they correspond to amplifiers. Many of you think you might need a 100-watt amp in order to be heard on a stage, or you might think you need a 100-watt amp because you think that more is more. And we're going to explain kind of the differences all the way down from a 5-watt amp with the Fender Champs clear up to a 100-watt Marshall Super Lead, so you'll get to hear about all the different wattages in between, the types of amplifiers that have these varying types of watts. We're going to talk a little bit about different tube complements, whether it's 6L6 or 6V6 or EL84 or EL34. And you're going to get to hear kind of our takes on that and where they really have their fit and why you might want to choose a certain wattage amp over another. And spoiler alert, you don't need a 100-watt amp. In fact, most people will struggle to even get a 40-watt amp to the point where it's quiet enough for them to use in the majority of gigs. And we talk about the circumstances and the environments that would call for different types of amplifiers, and also kind of link those to classic tones you might know and recognize from a lot of classic albums. So without further ado, I bring you Tony Lowe and I discussing a cool topic with wattages, amplifiers, headrooms. Here it is. All right. So today the conversation topic is all about different wattage amps and how high headroom amps, like 100-watt amps, for example, differ from lower wattage amps in terms of being able to achieve your tone. And I, for one, am a big proponent of higher wattage, cleaner amps in the use of pedals. And Tony is sort of the foil of that has got all of his great guitar tones using low wattage amps, getting all of the distortion and gain from the amplifier itself. So this should be an interesting conversation about amps, headroom, wattage, and how that actually translates to your tone and what actually might work for you in your home environment, your studio environment, in your live environment, depending on what type of guitar player you are in your context. So, Tony, give us, putting you on the spot, Tell us about maybe first how you achieve your tone. You have a really great, I mean, I guess I've only really heard you use single coil pickups. I don't know if I've ever heard you use a humbucking pickup, but
Yeah.
Strats and Tellies, and what are the amps you go for?
Yeah, well, I must say that I have played in bands where your method made a lot of sense. But if I'm playing my stuff, I like to consider the volume knob on a Fender Stratocaster or a Telecaster. That's the pedal board. That's the gain, So, in other words, I like to be able to roll that knob down to about 6 and get a real nice clean sound. 7 and 8 are more of my rocky rhythm type sounds. And then if I want to get nasty, it goes all the way up, and that's your solo boost. So for a player like me, it makes a lot of sense to have a variety of amps that will size themselves to the room. That means to do it, one has to know what the qualities are that they want in terms of the envelope of each note, how much gain they want out of the amp. But you're cranking the amp to a place where it sounds good to you. And you're cranking it to where you can get those different shades of dirty. Now, I must say also that as we're talking about this, it's really important to note that it doesn't always, people often think that a small amp, you just crank them to death, and that's what you do with a small amp, but you get lovely clean sounds as well. It's just the interplay between the guitar and amp becomes more critical.
Right.
So some of my favorites at different sizes, obviously any kind of like Tweed Champ would be, if you're going real quiet, let's say you're sheltered in place in April of 2020, you might want to have a little Champ or a little Silver Tone by the couch. To play a gig with, even a deluxe reverb for a lot of players, if they were cranking it, is a loud amp. Nice for a low level clean or a medium level clean, but not so great crank to 10. Now, I like it like that, but, well, maybe not 10. Princeton Reverb's very nice. My main amp with my trio right now is I plug into a Fender Reverb unit, one of those big, boxy, springy, tubey guys, and it goes right into a 62 Deluxe, and that's all the effects there are. It just goes right into that sucker, and it matches the level of the drums perfectly.
Now, I mean, in terms of, I think one thing for people that are not familiar with those amps, especially a lot of the younger listeners, can you sort of give us like maybe a reference tone that maybe like what a, say, deluxe reverb sounds like, in a used in your context, what a Tweed Deluxe might sound like in your context, what a Tweed Champ might sound like maybe connecting that to a record or a kind of a classic tone that we may know, so people sort of understand like what that sort of gain tone sounds like when you're using those small amps to produce the distortion sound.
Sure. So the classic examples are, if you take a Fender Tweed Champ, those have been recorded so many times that it's just, one can't even count. But you take the Layla record, right. Derek and the Dominoes, Layla, that whole record, you're hearing champs at various levels of crankedness. Dwayne is rocking a Les Paul, and Clapton's got the Strat, and it just sounds like, if you listen to Bell Bottom Blues, it sounds like he's plugged into a little champ, and it's cranked up, and it's got a microphone on it. Notice, not dimed all the way to tube meltdown, just turned up to where the guitar is interacting with the tubes, and you get that beautiful bouncy feel to it.
The Champ's an 8-inch speaker?
A Champ is an 8-inch speaker. Now, you're getting into a really great point, because one of the great things about little amps is you can you have the space and you've got the back strength to bring in a little amp and another cabinet if you want to hear it through something else. And if you take a little champ in that tiny little cabinet with that little 8-inch speaker, and you disconnect that speaker and plug it into an extension speaker cabinet with a bigger 12-inch speaker in it, man, you can get a pretty fat sound. But that little 8 or a 10, sometimes you see them with a 10, a microphone on that in the studio, and it sounds more like what you think a Fat Marshall's going to give you. You're getting out of that little champ.
Mm-hmm. What about kind of the next size up that you talked about?
All right. So if that's not quite loud enough, the next step up, I would say for most people, is going to be a Princeton Reverb. Now, it's a different kind of amp. Players are very used to the deluxe reverbs and the Blues DeVilles, those kinds of Fenders that are, I would say the deluxe is on the smaller side of the mid-range, and the, Blues DeVilles are loud as heck. So the Princeton is a warmer sounding amp than the deluxe. And I mean that in two different ways. You're rocking 6 V6s, it's lower wattage, and it's going to kind of brown up, kind of give you that compression like you get from a compressor pedal or a light overdrive pedal at a lower place in the volume level department. It's also not quite as bright and harsh. It's a little bit of a different circuit. So if you've ever plugged into a deluxe reverb and you've tried changing the speaker and it just never seems to get rid of that hard high end, the Princeton kind of loses that on its own because it doesn't have the same. There's like a wired in bright switch on a deluxe reverb, and you don't have. It's like it's always on, and you can't change it without doing surgery.
Right.
A Princeton's going to give you a little softer attack.
What would be an example of the Princeton in context?
Yeah, great. Any Jim Campolongo record that he's made after the 10 Gallon Cats records. So if you he's got a real good one called Dream Dictionary. And I think that Jim uses some funky things that are kind of left of center in the studio, but everything he does in the studio is just to capture the sound of his little Princeton reverb. If you sit in front of Jim Campolongo, that he just sounds like a Princeton reverb, and the records sound like a Princeton reverb too.
And where would you fit the Tweed Deluxe in the reference point between the Champ Princeton reverb? Would you say that's the next step up in terms of headroom, or would you say it's in the middle, or how would you categorize it?
That is a great question, and we can go a little bit into the weeds on this one.
Okay.
So the Tweed Deluxe is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, amplifier circuits ever made for an electric.
Which version, though?
Okay.
There's different versions.
Good. Great question. So, they're all a little different. Now, the earlier ones, you've got your TV front deluxes, right?
So this is the 5C3.
I'm going to be honest. Sometimes I lose track of which letters, but anything where if you were to look at it, it's got tweed in a big way, framing the grill cloth all the way around, and it's like big and thick and fat. Mm-hmm. So it's not even the wide panel yet. I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but
the way I think about them is the way that you see the speaker grill cloth. It's more kind of oval or circular,
yes,
in relationship to the cab, as opposed to very square or rectangular as the later 50s ones were.
Great. Yeah, and basically you're going to see with one of those, this kind of rounded grill cloth section, those, in my humble opinion, tend to be the ones that you're really just going to crank it and use it as like a special thing. Like it's a special effect where you are just cranking the sucker, Now, when you get into the wide panels, you've got some more variety. And I think this is where you're seeing the 5C3 circuit, etc. Those are going to have a little bit of a cleaner, it's like a jazzier sound, almost like a Gibson sort of sound. If you've ever heard it, I guess a lot of people have never heard a Gibson amp, but it's just a smokier tone. It doesn't really seem like it wants to give up the grease, but it's a good tone. You know, it's a if you were to get into a smoky jazz club in the middle of the 50s and plug a Gibson Birdland into the thing, you're going to be playing at a nice reasonable volume with that kind of almost like T-Bone Walker almost kind of sound, where it's not quite clean ever, but it never really gets super dirty either. Does that make sense?
And this is the narrow panel ones you're saying?
Not yet, actually.
Not yet. Okay, so you're still talking about the rounded.
Well, no. There's a middle point. So we went TV front. Now we're talking wide panel.
Okay, but not the one that sort of the one that preceded sort of the most famous of the Tweed Deluxes.
Yeah, we did the TV front. Now we're proceeding the
5C3. Got it. Okay.
And now we get to the 4-input Fender Tweed Deluxe as made famous by Neil Young et al.
The 5E3.
What did I say?
Well, it started with the TV front. I don't remember what the designation was for the number, the partner, the circuit number, the model number. And then it went 5C3 and then 5E3, which is sort of the Neil Young one.
Yeah, well, it goes through a bunch of letters, you know.
Yeah, there's a bunch of letters.
But just the famous one that you're going to see that they've reissued and everything is the 5E3. Now, right. Here's a little known fact, Mason. Some of those are 5, some of them are 5, I think it's like 5F3 or something. Like they're not all 5E3, but that's just all the way to like 1960 or, you know, they have like some that are not 5E3, but it's the same principle, same circuit. Mm-hmm. So you've got your 5E3 and that's the one. Now, what is that? What are the sounds? We don't even know. It's been on so many records. If you want to hear one that's absolutely unadulterated, cranked halfway up with a Les Paul smash in the front, you go to Neil Young and Crazy Horse. The album Zuma really sounds like Tweed Deluxe. That's that sound.
Also, you know, Asia, all the Larry Carlton parts, or pretty much any Steely Dan record up until the 80s would have primarily, if it's Larry Carlton, would have been a 5E3.
Yeah. His 335 plugged into a 5E3 is Kid Charlemagne.
Right. A lot of people think that's a Dumble, but it's a Tweed Deluxe.
Right. I mean, they just sound fantastic. And so you made a great point. Larry Carlton would be setting his, you know, at a lower volume level. It's not cranked. The volume knob on a Tweed Deluxe, you've got 4 inputs. You plug into that first input, the bright channel, and if you just crack it, just bring it up to about 3, even though it says 3 out of 12, you've already got about half the volume you're going to get. When you get that volume, it's got a fast taper, I think is what you would say. So you get that up to about halfway, and from 6 to 12, all you're doing is getting more and more squishy crunchy. 6 is already quite distorted. 3, you've got some dynamics, and you can get a little bit of grit on it if you dig in. So that's
right, and there's also that trick by using the second volume control.
Yes. Now, here's something that players are going to want to know, because I see all the time people talk about on the internet. Oh yeah, I love a Tweed Deluxe, man. It's got those interactive knobs where you bridge the channels. Stop. Do not bridge the channels on a Tweed Deluxe. Now, if you're playing a Marshall or you're playing a big old 4-input Bassman, different circuit. You can mix the channels that way. On a Tweed Deluxe, there's no, I mean, I guess you could, but you're missing out. Because one of the magical things about a Tweed Deluxe is that both of those channels are pulling on half of the 12AX7 that's a preamp. Actually, it would be a 12AT, I think a 12AT7, a 12AY7 in the original, what they ask for, I believe.
Right, in terms of the tube chart.
Yeah, on the tube chart. And that's another thing you can play with for different sounds. But basically, let's say you take that instrument channel I was just talking about, you plug into the bright input and you turn that volume up to about 6. You've got a nice rocky rhythm tone with your guitar's volume up. And then if you bring in that other knob, it starts to do things to the sound because it's sucking, I guess, what is it, voltage or something from the preamp tube.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're doing is you can kind of scoop it out some. Scoop it out meaning cut the mid-range. And
also attenuate it too.
Well, yeah, sure. It gets quieter, it gets cleaner. And so what you could do is bring that instrument volume up pretty dang high, like all the way up to 10, and then scoop it out with that other mid without jumping channels. All you got to do is turn up that channel you're not using, and then the interactiveness is going to give you a piano-like clean tone that you wouldn't normally get from a little ankle biter like a Tweed Deluxe. Now, a Tweed Deluxe is not going to be that loud. And one of the limiting factors of it is the speaker. So they come with a variety of speakers. If you're buying a vintage one, sometimes it has a P12R, which is an Alnico Jensen that's very low wattage. It can handle almost nothing. You're going to fuzz out that speaker. And if you want that nasty, dirt bomb tone, you don't mind that. You really don't. If you want something a little more like, well, I want a small amp, but I'm really going for a stouter, bigger sound, well, you can switch then to a ceramic magnet speaker. And a lot of guys did that because you'll blow that old P12R.
Right.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say some of them come with a P12Q, which is just the same sound basically, but it handles a little better. I like a P12Q. What were you gonna say?
Well, and I have a 59 5E3, and it didn't have the original speaker. It had another substitute Jensen Alnico in there. That was maybe a few years later than the amp was in terms of its code, but yeah, it was a little bit too farty to use for the majority of things. I put a Celestian Gold in it, so it was still Alnico, but had a little bit more power handling.
Yeah. Do you have to take the bell off?
No, I didn't.
Oh, that's cool.
No.
So my Tweed, I've had Tweed Deluxe before. But now I use a really rare amp that's kind of known these days. It's a DeArmond amp, and mine, I'm from Toledo, Ohio, where they made them, and I have the prototype DeArmond that it's an exceedingly rare creature, and it's basically an overbuilt Fender Deluxe. When I had my Fender Tweed Deluxe, it's still my favorite circuit, but owning both of them didn't make sense, and there was never a situation where I preferred the Tweed Deluxe. So the DeArmond just won all around. And it's basically just a Tweed Deluxe with bigger transformers. And the reason, and kind of like a fatter power section, kind of beefed up power supply, I think. The reason I mention it is that with that amp, this Tweed Deluxe circuit produces a ton of low end that it doesn't get reproduced by the P12R, which is why people say they get real farty. But in the DeArmond, man, I stuck a C12N, like it's the same speaker it would be in a twin reverb, and it just sounds amazing. It sounds like it sounds like a little Tweed twin. You know, it's just a fat sound. Yeah,
nice.
But too aggressive.
Well, I remember that amp. I remember that amp though. I mean, it's great.
Too aggressive though for my trio. So the Brown Deluxe wins for now.
Got it. With the reverb. Now, one thing when you were talking about your signal path, do you ever have issues if you're getting a lot of gain from the Brown Deluxe, and then you have your spring reverb tank running in front of an amp that's producing some distortion?
Well, that's kind of the key. No, it's not an issue. It's the sound.
It's part of the sound.
Yeah, anytime you hear the people that use those outboard reverb tanks, it's a real special thing. And the most excessive and over the top use of it is if you hear Neil Young's, say like Ragged Glory or Arc Weld, the live discs that went with it. You're hearing the reverb hit the front of the amp, and the reverb is kind of compressed. So if the listeners are familiar with a ducking delay, where the delay is real, the ambience is real quiet while you're playing, and then you let off, and suddenly the delays come rushing in. The reverb does that. So it's like you're playing and you're hitting notes, and you can hear all the articulation, and then the reverb whoosh comes whooshing in after the notes, and it's a sound that once you hear it, you're like, oh. Wow, that's a classic sound. I don't know where I've heard it. I'm sure I've heard it a million times, but here it's happening, and it's a phenomenon. And it's actually, if I can get an amp to be a little on the edge of breakup, and I plug that outboard Fender reverb tank into the front end, that's probably the most important thing for me. That's the source.
Well, I mean, it's a great sound. I love, I don't have one that's the same area as you do. I have a late 60s reverb tank Fender one.
Yeah, yours is actually cooler than mine because I'm using the reissue one.
Oh, got it. Yeah, this thing sounds great. You know, at first when I got it, my friend Pat had given it to me, and I haven't. The last one that I had worked on was probably like 10 years ago, and I modified one that wasn't quite going 100% wet. So I was modding it to go 100% wet and to accept line level so that it could be used like in a mixing bus, like in a studio. But anyway, so I had forgotten that it has that dampener on the back of it when you travel that you lock in place against the reverb tank. And so I was like, man, this reverb sounds really weak. Like I had it all the way up, and I could hardly get any effect from it. I was like, geez, what's wrong with this thing? And I was like, all right, I'm going to have to take it apart. And so, I look in the back and I see that it's all clamped down. I was like, oh yeah, that's right.
Dude, there are some very weird people that get into those reverb. How loose are the springs? They'll take the springs out and put different springs in. They will screw the thing all the way down to it makes it, all of the mechanical things that can happen change the sound of an outboard tank. And what happened for me is I have this particular reissue reverb tank. And by the way, the pan makes a big difference. You need the made in the USA. I forget.
Yeah, the old Accutronics ones.
Yeah, the later reissues, they switched to a different pan that kind of, it's just not. Yeah. But I didn't do anything. I got this, and it sounded right. And there are snobby things I could do to it to play with the tank, to switch out the tubes. But I said, it's working. And I'm just going to leave it because there's too many variables, man.
Well, if people are going to get into experimenting with their tanks, certainly the newest versions of what's available is just not even near the quality of what was made in the up into the 80s. Or even, I think Accutronics officially moved to Korea in the 90s with that buyout. But I've done a lot of experimentation because I bought that Super Reverb from you, which didn't have a reverb tank. And that kind of put me down the rabbit hole, where I bought the mod reverb tank, which is something that a lot of current amps that have built-in reverbs would have in it. And I think Mojo Tone makes that one. And that one actually I thought was about the best that you could get of a current version of a spring tank. But the spring tanks make such a difference in the sound for sure, and definitely getting a vintage one. And I actually found the best source if you do have a vintage amplifier and you're looking to replace it, depending on the size of the amp, I suppose, the ones that are in the Fender PAs that were up until the late 70s, those have the same reverb tank that's in the Twins and the Vibro, not a Vibro Lux, that was a smaller tank, but the Twins, the Bandmasters, the Bandmaster Reverb, the Dual Showmans, and the Pro Reverbs. Those would fit a lot of the Fenders. So that was an easy way to get one, and you can buy a Fender PA head for $150, which is about how much it costs to find a vintage pan, and they're not always in great shape, when you get them. And so if you can find a PA head, it's an easy way to harvest a reverb if you need it.
Dude, that is a great tip. And if you're a big amp nerd, man, you can pull those transformers and pots and tubes out of that PA and start building your Dumble clone.
Yeah, or just use them for backups, because a lot of those parts are the same across Fenders. Fenders really are the same preamp section in almost every one, especially if they're from the same generation, like a Blackface. It's the power sections that really start getting different, and then if they have reverb or tremolo or both. So you can definitely cross-pollinate on a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Good call.
Yeah.
So, I talked a lot. What else did you want me to say, or what did I miss there?
Well, let's kind of recap, and then maybe we can decide if we want to go back for seconds or whether we're full. So, tell me if I'm wrong here. We had a couple of different amps that were discussed as far as examples of getting great drive tones from the amp using smaller wattage. Everything you mentioned, I think, here was sub 20 watt.
And I went all Fender, by the way. That was all Fender amps.
Right. So except for talking about your D-Armond, which I guess is still a derivative of that. But even the Gibson amps of that time were really Fender amps with a few differences.
I have to beg to differ there, actually.
Okay.
If you open up the back of a Gibson amp, it is a full-on rat's nest from the 50s. Now, I happen to love some of those amps, but the reason I don't just say, well, yeah, a GA20 Crest or a properly modified Falcon by Skip Simmons. By the way, if you have a little Gibson amp, Skip Simmons in California is your man.
Yep, he's out in Marysville, California, kind of out past Sacramento.
Yeah, he does the best modifications on Gibson Falcons in the world. They're very sought after. So, but anyway, they're different. Like a Fender. Leo Fender was a stickler. He wanted the layout an exact way for ease of serviceability, and he was, while sure he would use out of spec components here and there or whatever he had around. He's known to be frugal in that way. You can count on those amps to sound like each one's going to have a personality.
You're talking about the Gibsons.
No, I'm saying the Fenders, you can count on a predictable personality from each
one.
I
see.
I see. And I'm saying the Gibsons, not at all. If you said, hey, Tony, I've got a GA20 from 1952, guess what? I don't know what it sounds like.
Right, but in terms of their circuit origin, my understanding is that they are fairly similar to the Fender Tweed style amplifiers. Now, the execution could be different. Is that not your understanding?
It's not. It's just not true. In fact, I would, if anything, if you can say that, then you would be looking at them being a good 8 years behind Fender. And they were going for a much different kind of sound. I mean, a Gibson with two 6v6s, they probably went for octal tubes, long and I think later than Fender. They did switch to the 8-pin preamp or whatever it is, or what is it, 9-pin, right? The 12AX7.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the octal is the 8. Anyway, they even then they were mellower, they were softer, and it's that smokier sound I was talking about with the TV front Fenders.
Right. Well, one of the principal differences that I know of them, and again, I haven't worked on a lot of Gibson amps, but it's been relayed through other technicians and stuff like that they're sort of similar. Now maybe they're 8 years behind, but I think that there's like a Fender amp that you can point to with kind of that parallels what the Gibson line was. But one of the primary differences was that their input impedance was much lower, half of what a Fender would be. So a Fender amp is typically 1 mega ohms, in the input, which is, the standard most of us were used to hearing for a while. The Gibsons are at 500K typically on the input. And so it loads the guitar pickups quite a bit, double what the Fender would. So they are going to be darker just by the input impedance comparatively to what you're used to hearing on a Fender.
Yeah.
That was a quick aside.
But I'm telling you, dude, that I don't. It's just not true. They're their own animal, and they're not like there's no. You can't look in a Gibson and go, well, this is their version of a.
Right. Okay.
Now the tube complement, sure, but the circuit, absolutely not.
We should get on a vintage Gibson expert to talk about it. Maybe there's a great YouTube channel, a guy called or his channel name is 5 Watt World, and I would suspect that he knows a thing or two about these amplifiers. He does these videos where they're like kind of short histories of various sort of classic electric guitars and amplifiers and stuff like that. So he might be a good guy to ask, because I'm certainly don't know an expert on vintage Gibson amplifiers. But anyway, to recap, we talked about the Champ. We talked about its connection with kind of the classic Eric Clapton, Derek and the Dominoes, Duane Allman sound. We talked about the Princeton Reverb and kind of connecting that with the Jim Campolongo sound. We talked about the Tweed Deluxe, the few different generations that existed, about Neil Young on the Zuma album, Crazy Horse, being an exemplar of that sound, and also Larry Carlton with Steely Dan up until about the 80s. And also about not bridging the channels of the Tweed Deluxes, actually just using the mic volume, but only plugging into the instrument input, or what is it called, the bright input on the Tweed Deluxe, and then using the second volume control to take away some of the mids or even attenuate the output by using that, or doing it just the Larry Carlton way, Tweed on 3, and then riding your volume control to go between your clean and dirty sound. Did that cover kind of the basics? Yep.
And the only thing I would add is, just for an example of the Brown Deluxe, like what I'm using, the one that's 62 to 61 to 62 is really it.
Right.
That would be like, if you listen to ZZ Top, Just Got Paid, would be a good example of that sound.
Of the Crank 62 brown face.
Yeah, that would be that's a classic version of that, and that's when you're going for the heat. You can get a nice clean sound too.
Yeah, that's Just Got Paid's a great tone.
Yeah. So that's pretty much that for my favorite little amps, and I just went Fenderland. You could also, if you wanted a British sound, there's certainly, little AC-15s, but I always found that they were loud anyway.
Right. Yeah. Well, also, an AC-15 still had a 12-inch speaker. Most of those that you talked about, other than your brown face, right? Those are all 10 or 8-inch speakers.
Well, Tweed Deluxe is a 12.
Oh, that's right. Tweed Deluxe is a 12. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the place where I'm coming from is sort of the, not that I don't appreciate those tones. I really like those tones a lot that you talked about, but so much in the pedal boarding, or pedal boarding side is about trying to provide as much versatility as possible under the conditions with which musicians find themselves in 2020. And the days of being able to bring multiple different amplifiers and capture a variety of sounds, or capture the variety of sounds that are found on an album. People are rarely recording with just one amplifier or a singular guitar tone, and so it's difficult to justify or to convince a guitar player that they could scale back on their drive pedals and just simply use amp X as their dirty tone exclusively. So in my world, what people are doing is sort of the opposite of that, which is that they're using a clean amplifier platform, and there's various price points with which people do it. And I don't know what you think is going to be the best way to sort of describe this as far as what's most helpful. But what I was thinking I would do, Tony, is talk about maybe a couple different price points of amps that people would commonly use, and how using the pedals into the clean amp, what that gives you. I don't think that it's really a worth comparing sort of thing, because no pedal is going to sound as good as a Tweed Deluxe. Even if you have a Tweed Deluxe emulating pedal, I don't think you could ever hope that your pedal would be able to convincingly sound like a Tweed Deluxe. You would obviously have to have one on stage and have some sort of amp switcher in order to really bring in that sound with complete fidelity. But what it is doing is it's allowing a player to show up to a gig with one amp and be able to have realistic, to a degree, emulations of those sounds that would all go through the same clean amplifier platform. And then maybe kind of talking about different platforms that you could use at different price points to kind of get there.
Yeah, and just to be really clear, what we're talking about when we say that, you're not going to have a pedal that sounds just like an amp, it's because, with a small amp cranked, you're getting some voltage strangeness with there's like the interaction of the transformer with the speaker. You're getting speaker saturation, the tubes are breaking up, and basically a player is dialing in their amp to get the exact this very complex soup of phenomena happening. And so to try to get all that to happen in a pedal and then put it through an amp where now it's got all these new variables happening and then out of a clean speaker, I mean, why would you even do that? Just get a different tone. So go ahead, Mason. Where do you want to take this?
Well, I think that there's some sort of ground rules to sort of set in terms of that, which I already, I think, started to a degree, which was, that no pedal will ever be able to do what a tube amplifier does, even if it's oriented toward that sound. And the reasons are, like what you said, is that when a pedal, even if it's designed exactly as the preamp of the amp that it's emulating, let's say, with 12AX7 tubes and all that, pedals don't have the voltage necessary unless it's got an AC plug on it to even get the tubes to do what a preamp inside an amplifier is doing.
Right.
And then it's that preamp, even if it's built completely exactly as a Tweed Deluxe, it's now going into another preamp, another tube preamp in your amplifier input itself. So you now have two cascaded preamp sections going into each other, which is fundamentally going to change the tone. Because when you plug into a Tweed Deluxe, You have its preamp section, you have its power amp section, and it's it. Everything is part of that amp.
Yep.
Now you have a preamp section cascading a preamp section, and then that second preamp has the power amp presumably built into it if it's a combo amplifier or a head of some kind instead of a disaggregated rack style preamp.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things to consider there, even if you did make it exactly the same way. The only way to really be able to do that, if you were really trying to go for that exact sound, is sort of what these guys are doing with this company called Synergy, where they're essentially making tube preamp sections of classic amps that are actually designed by the builders of those amps. So they have one that Mike Soldano made, and they have one that Joe Morgan made, and Dave Friedman made, and Bruce Egnater, and they're designed to go into the return of your effects loop. And the return for your effects loop is basically another way of saying your power amp input. So you're able to use their preamps and select between them, and then use the power amp, a tube power amp, of any tube amp that has an effects loop. So you could even use something as inexpensive as a Hot Rod Deluxe to do this. That would be the closest way if you were really trying to go for getting that sound in a small package and not actually having to have the amp on stage. That would be one way to do it. So I just wanted to use that as a long disclaimer about the suggestions that I will make, and different ways to do it.
But to be clear, Mason, I think I don't think that is exact. I mean, what I just was talking about was getting the speaker to saturate the power section, and you're just talking about a preamp, which you're getting the tonal flavor of a different amp, but you're getting the sound of a different amp that's exactly the same wattage and power as the one you previously had.
Right. Yeah. So there's going to be fundamental differences no matter what.
Exactly.
You can't stack the deck to be exact. But I think what you lose, I think where the real benefits are of using cleaner amps, or one of the ways, is that you can show up to a gig and you can have your Marshall flavor, you can have your Dumble flavor, you can have your Tweed, kind of twin, or your Tweed Deluxe flavor, and you can have any or even other types of overdrives that are not even specifically trying to emulate any particular amp sound. Maybe just a type of clipping that you like, and you can select them with a flip of a switch. And it's very difficult to, even get channel switching amplifiers really to, one, have that flexibility, and secondly, being able to always go back to your reference clean tone. Like the challenge I always found with channel switching amps, even the really great ones, is they tend to really do the drive channels great, and the clean channels are kind of a compromise. Like you could never really get back to Fender Twin, no matter how great the amp was. And if you're using a platform that's sort of like a Fender Twin, like a cleaner black face style Fender, which has sort of become the standard for a clean amp platform, kind of a more scooped mid-range clean amp, something like a Hot Rod DeVille, Hot Rod Deluxe, stuff like that has become really, really standardized for this purpose. I also think a more boutique version would be like the Port City Pearl, is a really clean amplifier platform that takes pedals well. Even some of the Two Rocks do a really good job, depending on what the model is, at accepting pedals into the front of the amplifier. And these are really great so that you can take kind of a tonal palette and you can mix them in the front of those preamps, and they will sound pretty great. And you can have everything done on your pedal board in addition to your delay processing and reverb treatments and modulation and stuff like that. And you also don't have to have any concern about having your amps to have effects loops, because you're putting the preamps in your pedals before your delays that go into an amplifier that isn't creating any distortion. Because the real benefit about having an effects loop is that you're not going to be overdriving your delays and reverbs because they're not getting the saturation of the preamp coming after them. They're before, the preamp section is before the delays and reverb. So there's some really obvious flexibility, travelability, mobility benefits of going the route of using pedals in a clean amp platform, like I mentioned, Fender Hot Rod DeVille's, Hot Rod Deluxes. Those are kind of the lower inexpensive end of that. And then, you can go up into, the Two Rocks if you wanted to go really expensive and look at something like their traditional clean, or some of their kind of Dumble steel string Singer emulating versions tend to do pretty well with pedals. And then if you wanted something kind of more in the middle, kind of somewhere between like the super expensive boutique, but still high quality handmade, something like the Port City Pearl, I think is a really great alternative and beautiful hand-wired amp and very, very well built. And I think reasonable given the attention to detail that goes into that particular amplifier. But the other thing I want to talk about is using 100-watt amps for an actual tone, because there are guys that just cranked 100-watt amplifiers, and although that isn't our context for most of us that we can even take a 100-watt amplifier anywhere, there will always be guys like, a Ritchie Blackmore or a Jimi Hendrix or I'm trying to think a David Gilmour. Now, those guys all use pedals to a degree, because I think there is a big misnomer around when people hear the word Marshalls. I think especially younger guitar players that I interact with on YouTube and on Instagram, when a lot of people say, well, this is my Marshall emulating pedal, it's really emulating a very specific type of Marshall, because as we know, the Marshalls that I think made Marshall famous really didn't have any gain at all.
Yeah. If I may comment.
Yeah, please.
So remember, I made a real strong pitch for why I need the whole amp to be interacting, how I want the reverb in front of my distortion coming from the amp, because it's not really distortion, it's just kind of driving, blah, 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 blah. I need dynamics. So the reason you would go for this fatter, bigger, louder, cleaner platform, there are great reasons to do it that, Mason, you've already mentioned. If you need a loud, clean sound, you're not going to get that out of a little amp that's breaking up. If I needed a variety of sounds, I wouldn't do what I'm doing. I'm doing my thing for my music, and when I play clean, the whole band is quiet. So I don't need to play a solo that's real hard and clanky and twangy. So I don't need a big amp to do that. Now, what you're talking about in terms of what the platform gives you tonally from a big amp, it's extremely wide. Most players, I agree with you, have probably never actually heard or played with, many even stood in front of a real 100-watt plexi. And I think if they did, most players would be horrified by what came back at them.
And not that it has this amazing amount of gain. It's basically a Marshall equivalent to a twin reverb. It's a very clean amplifier.
Yeah, you hit a chord expecting this beautiful, compressed, squishy. You think it's going to sound like the beginning of, what's a Van Halen, Ain't Talking About Love.
Right, or Panama or something like that.
Yeah, you think you're going to get Panama. And when you hit it, what you get is more of like I don't even know what to call it. It's like imagine a big acoustic guitar that's so loud and fat and intense that when you hit a note, you feel someone kicks you in the chest. Like, that's how intense it is with a full stack at 100 watts.
Absolutely. And I mean, in some of them were, could be pretty hi-fi. I always found the JTM 45s that had, like KT style tubes in them could be really glassy. And like you could see why a guy like Jimi Hendrix would have to use a coily cable with some of those, because they were so bright and top end piercing that you would need it just to attenuate some of the treble. And you would also need the fuzz. You would need a fuzz with those amplifiers if you wanted to get any sort of distortion out of them, unless they were just so ungodly loud, because they don't really break up until they're really, really pushing a lot of volume. And with a 412 cabinet or multiple 412 cabinets, as you would have seen with Eric Clapton or with Jimi Hendrix, it would have just destroyed you. You know, like there'd be so much fatigue. You know, it would be unbelievable on your ears.
Well, and
so you need a fuzz face. There's no way you could do without it.
And keep in mind, it was on almost all the time. Like he when he rolled his Stratocaster volume up to 10, which would be almost like a rare part of a set, you're hearing a fuzz face into a Marshall on 10, and then when he backed it off, you're hearing the fuzz face still on, just cleaned up with the volume knob of the guitar. And another thing, Mason, to go with what you're saying, what are there? There's probably 10 famous guitar players who really made their name on the sound of a big loud Marshall, and we really don't know what their techs were doing with their Marshalls. Those guys were always tweaking on things, messing with voltage. A lot of them clipped out little doodads in there. The super lead to super bass is what, like one little piece of
yeah, it's a few components.
Yeah, and they snipped those out of there, and they made it voiced however they wanted it. Jimmy Page was playing, and Richie Blackmore, they're playing 200 Wattage, man.
Yeah, it's in Richie Blackmore's case, I think he was using a treble booster to push the front end of the amplifier, and Jimmy Page tone benders and stuff like that at different times.
Well, and the EP2 as well. He would always have an Echoplex in line, which fattens up and changes the character.
Yeah, add some more mids to it for sure. Definitely warms it up. Yeah, I mean, I think that the misnomer about Marshalls is they really are pretty much a clean amp platform in the vintage ones that most of us think about when we hear the word plexi. The thing that happened with the plexis is that guys like Van Halen and Randy Rhoads and guys like that would modify them or slave them together. And in I think an easy way to think about slaving them is you're basically using one, like you would use a distortion pedal to hit another one into the front. You know, so when you hear that term, that's essentially what they're doing is they're juicing one up, you know, like you would, you know, an overdrive pedal, and then putting it into the input of another one that it's cascading into to basically create an overdrive pedal, you know, a huge overdrive pedal out of one of those amps. And then that's one of the ways that they were doing it. And then Marshall started coming out with master volume versions in the mid to late 70s. I'm not sure the exact year, but this was with the JMP eras, which came long after the plexis. You know, so the plexis weren't designed to do that.
In fairness, I don't think that when they were daisy chaining them, they were running one into the other. I think they were just hanging a cord off of the adjacent input into the next amp. So they're just running a slightly padded down cord. You know, in other words, I don't think they're plugging the speaker out into the input of the next amp.
No. They were their technicians, like on Van Halen's. They would make a slaved out, a line out type thing, and they'd basically use it. You know, and it would, I guess it would be coming out at instrument level. And I'm sure that actually I could ask Dave Friedman, because Dave has worked on a lot of Eddie's amps over time. But my understanding is they were basically using the preamp section of one, gaining it up, and then putting it into the input of the next amp. So you could have one that's cranked, and then you bring it into the next amp, and then you could attenuate the volume on the amp that was receiving the slave, because that would become like the master volume. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That would become like the amp, and then the first amp would be like the pedal.
So and by the way, that's exactly what Neil Young does with his Tweed Deluxe. There is and I've done this with my DeArmond. So there's a little, it's just like two components. I forget, it's like a cap and a resistor, and basically you're wiring them from the speaker jack over to the adjacent speaker jack, and it takes it down. You still have to have your speaker hooked up or you'll blow everything up. But
right, so it needs a load.
Yeah, so it's loading it down, and you have basically a line level, kind of a line out of your amp, And the reason that it works so well is you're getting some of that kickback. I forget what you would call it, like some kind of reflexive voltage or something from the speaker, the way it talks to the transformer. And that phenomenon gives you this weird compression that you can only get from, it's not just an overdriven preamp, it's an overdriven power amp. And so that's going to go into your bigger amp or your next amp or your second amp. And that's what you're describing.
Yeah, I wonder where that insert is coming. You say it's coming after the power amp section.
Well, it's coming right at the speaker out. It's attached to the speaker out jack.
Right. So I think it would probably be somewhere in between the preamp and the power amp, almost like an effects loop.
No, it's not. I'm telling you, the speaker out. So it's already gone through everything. It's on its way to the speaker. Mm-hmm. And that's where you pad it, and it comes off of that.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be like a line out type thing.
It is. It's exactly a line out. And then can I read this to you, because this is right in line with a question we had on.
Yeah.
So this is from Rayo Drifters, and they were talking about Terry Kath from Chicago, who did exactly what we're talking about, where he took a small amp and he made this line out thing to feed his bigger amps. Here's a description, and I'm going to read. It's a long question. I'm just going to read it.
Okay.
They say, the late, great Terry Kath of the original Chicago Transit Authority had a unique sound. The first album on Columbia was a double LP, and it had some filler material, free-form guitar, featuring Terry invoking all kinds of distortion. The liner notes read, free-form guitar was performed on a Fender Stratocaster through a Showman amplifier, so there's your big amp, equipped with a twin 15 bottom, so two big 15 speakers, and now here's the kicker, utilizing a Bogan PA amplifier as a preamp. No electronic gimmicks or effects were used in the recording of this selection, the intent being to capture as faithfully as possible, blah, 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 and Rayo Drifter says, what the hell are they talking about? And the answer is that back in the day, if you were in a restaurant or something and they were paging you, Smith, party of three, your table is ready, you'd be hearing that over a little PA, and that would be a tube unit because it's all they had. A Bogan was one company that made these, and what they're talking about is Mr. Kath was plugging directly into this little Bogan PA that he had probably converted for guitar and turning it all the way up. Then he's padding down, like Mason described, the output using some sort of, I don't know what, resistor doodad, something Mason would know about. And then,
but is he saying though he's going to the Showman first and then going into that?
No, okay. He's plugging. This is a common thing that it's an old trick. You plug into something small so you get all that spongy goodness. And then he's taking the line level out, and then he has some sort of attenuator on it that he can control the how hot the signal is that's going into the front of the Showman. He's just taken exactly like what I was describing. It's like two little components. You can do it yourself if you look online for the circuit, but you just solder in like a resistor and just like a couple things, and then he's coming out line level and sticking that directly into the front end of that Showman.
Yeah, and line level will be hotter than most of the guitar signals will be used to seeing. Well, ideally, if it is an actual line out box, it'll have a transformer in it, and the reason is that some amps will not be in polarity or phase, as it's sometimes called, if you're combining them in that way, and so sometimes you'll need that in order to make sure that you're not inverting the polarity when you're combining those two amps in that fashion. But I think as there are other ways to do it that don't include that. But just wanted to give that as a quick aside.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to do it, the circuit, you can find it in the first Gerald Weber book, where he talks about a line level. I'm telling you, man, it's super old school, super common, and it's so easy that I personally did it, and I have no tech skills. I soldered this crap into my Tweed Deluxe, and then I had Skip stick it in the de-arming because it has a real nice sound.
Mm. And you could also just buy a line out box as well. Like John Sir makes one that's really good, and it does have a transformer in it as well.
Yeah, if you want to spend the extra $500 or $600.
No, I think it's maybe 120 or something. But yeah, it's more expensive than a DIY route, but it does have the transformer, which I think is important if you really want to do this reliably and you really want to line out on your amp. This will also be something you need if you want to run wet dry.
You could also just make friends with Mason and get him to do it for you.
I'm not making these. These are I couldn't do it for as cheap as John Sir could, or with a ready to go product.
He makes the El Hombre now. He makes an amp that's an exact copy of the 62.
That's right. I saw it at the NAMM show.
Yeah, that's my amp. It's exact. It's a component per component. It's the amp.
Nice. Have you tried one?
No, I don't have to because I have a real one.
Yeah. Well, I think that we gave people sort of a good understanding or I guess a starting understanding of kind of ways that different wattage amps and different amounts of headroom can kind of translate to different things. And certainly if you're doing a lot of different sounds or you're trying to encapsulate a lot of different sounds, doing it with a higher headroom amp, I mentioned that, it's kind of the low end, the deluxes, the hot rod deluxes, the hot rod DeVilles, which are, 40 to 60 watt amps, and then up to 100 watt amps like the Port City Pearl, which I actually think comes in a 50 and 100 watt version, as well as the Two Rock, traditional clean. I think that they have a couple of ones that range, around 100 watts plus that are at a higher price point, and those will certainly give you more versatility if you want to have a lot of different types of overdrive going into them with your pedals. You don't want to have to worry about, unless you want the sound, say, of your reverb tank going into a distorted amp, you can control better using distortion with delay and reverb and modulation in a way that might be a little bit more attuned to sort of the classical way that you would hear it on a record and things like that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. Like having a lower headroom amp that can produce the distortion, in particular, if you want to, you're going for your own sound and you're not trying to get, a wide color palette of overdrive varieties, and you have the thing that's kind of quintessentially your sound, like with Tony and his own band. It's certainly viable in all possible interpretations, and I'm actually interested to hear about what listeners' take is on some of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of amplifiers, in terms of applications for clean amps with pedals versus dirty amps with pedals. Certainly there's people that have been renegade and used a bunch of pedals with dirty amps. So there really is no right way. This is just sort of a perspective of two individuals that sort of have differing approaches to how they go about doing their own sound design. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Tony, to kind of help consolidate and summarize.
Just that I want to advise players, think about what you want to sound like. If you're in a cover band or something, then you've got your answer. You have to sound like all the hits you have to play for Joni and Ronnie's wedding. You gotta do your thing. But if you're trying to come up with your signature sound and you are relying on having a compressor and an overdrive on all the time, you may want to, that might be a perfect thing for you, but maybe not. Maybe you need to think about, I like this to be compressed and overdriven all the time. A smaller amp will give that to me and probably be a little more complex and sonically interesting. So it's just something to think about.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I certainly, as always, Tony, appreciate your perspective. I showed our first episode that we did together to a couple of different people in the industry, and two people said something really interesting to me, which is that they rarely get to hear people on podcasts, in particular in our industry, that maybe disagree is the wrong way to say it, but that have really different points of views in terms of how they achieve their tones, or even with our last episode regarding sort of John Mayer and Stevie Ray Vaughan tones. Like we didn't agree necessarily on that, and it's refreshing as they communicated to me to hear differing points of view on the same podcast that maybe take different opinions on things. So, and I know that that's not true of the whole podcast sphere, but it certainly was refreshing to me to get that opinion and that input, because I think it is important to understand that there really is no right way to do this. Ultimately, this is a matter of taste. The sound that you go for is a matter of taste. It's very subjective, and we can give people sort of pointers on sort of sonic cornerstones that we've come to know and understand, but that doesn't mean that people can't defy those or do their own thing or make great sounds with other techniques.
Yeah. And I would say you're not going to hear a whole lot of people with my point of view on gear-related podcasts, because it would be really hard for me to sell you a pedal when I'm telling you don't use it.
Although you do have a few of my pedals, but I don't know if that was just for sympathy.
No, it's not. Actually, and no, I get nothing from... well, that's not a fact. I've stolen a few things from Mason, but the point is, your stuff for me is problem solving. So, like for example, right now in the pandemic, I've got my de-armand is way too. It's all I have at the apartment. Everything else is at the practice space. So I have my de-armand with one of those 2-notes captor attenuators. But I have played, this would be a situation where I can employ the clean drive, the steel string singer, because it does kind of, it broadens the scope of the frequencies, so that if I want to sit in my apartment and play a different sound than how I crank with my group, now I am playing clean, and I want just like a real pretty sound. I have a use for it, And if I was playing in a band, I've also done a very little bit of session type stuff for friends and bands. And if I needed a variety of sounds, well, you better believe I'm going to dust off some of those overdrive pedals. I have a closet full of them. So,
right. Well, Tony, as always, it's great to speak with you and catch up. For those of you who are not familiar, Tony and I are thousands of miles away from each other. I'm in Oakland, California right now recording this, and Tony, you're in what city are you in right now?
I am in lovely Bowling Green, Ohio, where I fled to Ohio to study at Bowling Green State University for a little while. So I'm out here, out here between the fields learning stuff.
Right. Well, and we're all proud of you for making the jump and finishing your education.
Thanks, dude. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. It did take some courage to start there.
Yeah. Well, Tony, I think we gave the people some good stuff today, and I'll look forward to chatting with you again next week.
Dude, I'm so excited. We'll talk soon.
So that was our talk today on amps, on headroom, on how wattages affect the tone, why you might want to choose a lower wattage amp if you're playing small venues, and why you might want a higher wattage, cleaner style amp if you're going to be using a lot of distortion and overdrive pedals for the core of your sound and you want to be able to have a lot of variability very quickly. So I mentioned a bunch of cool amplifiers. I'm sure that there are more that do this, and so feel free to let us know either in our YouTube channel or through email or on Instagram or Facebook. We'd love to hear from you about your opinions about amps that maybe we overlooked in this conversation. And also, if you're a Gibson amplifier expert, I'm certainly not, but I do know that they have a 500K input impedance, which is sometimes tricky to navigate from a buffering standpoint if you're used to kind of hearing 1 meg and building for 1 meg. Not that can't be circumvented, because there's certainly buffers with 500K input impedances, but I'd like to hear from a Gibson expert. So if you're one of those people, we would love to hear from you. You can always email us at info@vertexeffects.com. But I'd also like to make sure that I'm thanking our sponsors, Blue Microphones, providing a Yeti microphone for us to do this, both me and for Tony. And I also want to thank our mixing engineer and editor, Hunter Harrison, our co-producer, Mason Mejia, and Tim Marco for doing all of the music explicitly and exclusively for our podcast. Until next time, I am Mason Marangella, the Rig Doctor. Adios.